Welcome everyone to Easy History Podcast. Today we're diving deep, into this really pivotal moment in the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Aspern-Essling,
Yeah.
1809. This clash I think has a lot to tell us about warfare and about the people involved. So we're gonna unpack what happened during those crazy 2 days, really get into why it mattered, in the grand scheme of things, and hopefully uncover what makes it such a compelling story.
Absolutely.
And we've got a lot to cover here, everything from what led up to the battle to the forces involved, the decisions made, in the heat of the moment, the fighting itself and the immediate aftermath.
Yeah.
It's definitely more than just, a list of events. This is, a real look at ambition clashing with strategy under the, harsh realities of war.
Yeah, absolutely. This battle really marks a turning point, I think, in the narrative of Napoleon's dominance.
Yeah.
By 1809, his French Empire had cast this, this long shadow across Europe.
Right.
But as you mentioned, the picture wasn't entirely one of, just unbroken French success.
Right.
The Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal was proving to be, a significant drain on Napoleon's resources.
Yeah.
Both in terms of manpower, but also just the attention of some of his best commanders. So this sort of presented this, this window of opportunity for Austria,
Yeah.
a nation that had, felt the sting of defeat against Napoleon
Yeah,
before.
exactly. The Austrians, they hadn't forgotten the drubbing they received at Austerlitz in
Oh, yeah.
1805. Truly a crushing loss for them. Now with Napoleon's focus seemingly split, in Spain, and with the promise of financial backing from Britain, coupled with the hope for potential diversions, against the French in Northern Europe, the moment appeared, opportune for them to once again challenge French power on the continent. And this time around, they had a new figure leading their armies, Archduke Charles, the emperor's younger brother.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to consider Archduke Charles himself. 37, just a couple of years younger than Napoleon.
Sure.
He already had 15 years of experience commanding troops in the field.
Wow.
But perhaps more importantly, he'd clearly taken the lessons of Austria's past defeats to heart.
Yeah.
He spearheaded significant reforms within the Austrian military.
Okay.
And what's fascinating here is that some of these reforms actually mirrored aspects of the French system itself. So, for example, the adoption of the corps structure,
Right.
providing more flexible and, self-contained organization. He also introduced new infantry tactics. So this wasn't the same Austrian army that had faced Napoleon in previous encounters.
Interesting. Okay, so let's unpack these new infantry tactics a little bit more, because our information talks about, this traditional close order fighting style where you've got infantry, packed tightly together, essentially a wall of men standing shoulder to shoulder.
Right.
It seems almost counterintuitive from our modern perspective, presenting such a dense target. What were the main reasons why this was the standard way to fight?
Well, there were several really crucial reasons for this.
Okay.
And they stem from the practical realities of warfare at the time. So firstly, just the ability to command and control large numbers of men on a very chaotic battlefield was paramount.
Sure.
In an era long before widespread radio communication orders had to be relayed through, shouted commands,
Right.
the beat of drums, the sound of bugles. So maintaining any semblance of order and cohesion in the thick of battle was a huge challenge, and it would have been virtually impossible if troops were spread out. Secondly, consider just the limitations of firepower.
Okay.
The muskets of that period, being smoothbore weapons, had very limited accuracy,
Right.
perhaps effective up to, about 80 yards at best. So by having large formations firing volleys simultaneously, you maximize the chances of hitting the enemy and, just as importantly, impacting their morale.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
A
Okay.
well-timed volley
Yeah.
could be devastating, even if individual shots weren't always on target.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's, strength in numbers for both putting more lead in the air and keeping everyone together, under fire.
Absolutely.
What were some of the other sort of key reasons for these close formations?
Well, thirdly, the psychological aspect of morale cannot be overstated.
Right.
Soldiers are inherently more likely to advance into danger
Sure.
or hold their ground when they are part of a tightly packed unit,
Yeah.
drawing courage and a sense of security from their comrades on either side. The feeling of being alone and isolated on a battlefield is incredibly demoralizing. And then finally, defense against cavalry was absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Spread out infantry was incredibly vulnerable to a charging line of horses. The only effective way for infantry to repel a cavalry charge was to remain in close formation.
Okay.
and particularly to form squares, a dense, all-around defensive formation bristling with bayonets that presented a difficult target for even the most determined cavalry.
Okay, so the basic building block here was the battalion, and our information gives us a picture of a typical French line battalion.
Right.
Theoretically around 840 men, but often in practice closer to, 500 or 600. And within these battalions, there were different types of companies with
Yes.
specific roles. Is that right?
Precisely. So a standard French line battalion was usually made up of 4 fusilier companies,
Okay.
which formed the main body, and then 2 flank companies.
Right.
On the right were the grenadiers,
Right?
typically the tallest and strongest men,
Okay.
often used for, more demanding or elite tasks.
Right.
On the left were the voltigeurs,
Okay.
who were specialized light infantry. Their role was to skirmish ahead of the main body,
Okay.
providing a screen, harassing the enemy, and trying to prevent the enemy's own skirmishers from doing the same to the French. And many armies, like, the British with their famous 95th Rifles and the French with their chasseurs à pied, also had dedicated light infantry units,
Right.
specifically trained for this kind of open order fighting.
Okay, so now when it came to how these battalions were actually deployed,
Yeah.
on the battlefield, we see descriptions of this traditional line formation which maximize the number of muskets
Yeah.
that could be brought to bear and minimize the risk from artillery,
Yep.
hitting large numbers of men at once. But it was vulnerable to cavalry and could be difficult to maintain over, broken terrain. And then there was this column of divisions, a much more compact
Right, that's
and
it.
flexible formation for maneuvering and launching attacks, but it presented a bigger target for artillery, and fewer muskets could actually fire at the enemy. It sounds like commanders were constantly facing a real trade-off here.
It was indeed a very delicate balance that commanders had to consider.
Right.
Ideally, a battalion would deploy into line just before engaging the enemy,
Yeah.
maximize its firepower,
Right.
but actually executing this maneuver under enemy fire was often extremely difficult
Sure.
and could lead to disorganization and heavy losses.
Right.
Some commanders, particularly the French and many of the earlier victories, opted to keep their troops in column
Right.
and rely on the sheer momentum of the attack to break through the enemy line. A very risky tactic
Yeah.
that could be effective against less experienced or less resolute troops,
Okay.
but could result in horrific casualties against well-trained and steady infantry.
Yeah.
And as our information points out, columns could be quickly closed up to offer better protection against cavalry,
Right.
or if there was enough time, they could form a square, which, as we discussed, was a formidable all-around defense against mounted attacks,
Right.
although quite vulnerable to concentrated artillery fire.
Yeah, and this brings us back to the Austrian military reforms, under Archduke Charles. One of the key changes they adopted was this battalion mass formation. This is described as being perhaps less refined than the French formations, but more suitable for their army, which often included a larger proportion of, hastily trained conscripts.
Right.
What were the main characteristics and advantages of this, battalion mass?
Yeah, so the battalion mass formation was essentially a very dense and deep column. It certainly offered limited firepower compared to a line,
Okay.
as only the men in the very front ranks could effectively discharge their muskets. And it also presented a much larger target to enemy artillery,
Right.
meaning a single shell could potentially inflict casualties on a greater number of men. However, its key advantages were that it could be formed very quickly,
Okay.
and it offered a solid mass that could quickly close ranks to repel cavalry charges.
Okay.
Similar in principle to a square, but without requiring the same level of complex drill and coordination. This was particularly important for troops who lacked extensive training.
Right.
Furthermore, the dense column was generally more maneuverable than a long, thin line,
Okay.
especially for less experienced troops who might struggle to maintain their alignment across varied terrain.
Right.
So this shift in Austrian tactics was a direct response to their earlier defeats against Napoleon, where their more traditional linear formations had often been broken by the speed and weight of French attacks. And it reflected a pragmatic recognition of the need to adapt their approach to the realities of Napoleonic warfare and the composition of their army.
So with these significant reforms, underway within the Austrian army and with Napoleon seemingly overextended in Spain, Austria felt that the time was finally right to strike back.
Right.
And Archduke Charles launches his main attack against France's ally Bavaria on April 10th, 1809.
Right.
Interestingly, our information highlights that this was a full week earlier than Napoleon had anticipated.
Right.
So this kind of catches the French emperor somewhat off guard.
Yeah, that element of surprise was certainly a factor that initially played to Charles's advantage. His aim was to achieve a rapid advance and potentially knock Bavaria out of the war before Napoleon could fully react.
Right.
However, a last-minute alteration to his strategic plans, coupled with unusually heavy rains and a very slow-moving Austrian baggage train,
Oh, wow.
significantly hampered the speed of the Austrian advance.
Yeah.
In the meantime, the French army in Germany was under the command of Marshal Berthier,
Right.
who, while an exceptionally gifted chief of staff and administrator for Napoleon, lacked the same decisive leadership qualities when commanding in the field independently.
Okay.
So as a result, the French forces were somewhat dispersed,
Yeah.
leaving Marshal Davout's highly regarded Third Corps in a potentially dangerous and isolated position
Okay.
near Regensburg. So Archduke Charles's initial objective was to converge his larger forces and effectively destroy Davout's corps
Right.
before other French units could come to his aid.
But then the man himself,
Right.
Napoleon,
Yes.
arrives on the scene at Dunworth on April 17th and immediately takes personal command of the situation.
Yeah.
Recognizing the danger to Davout, he orders him to begin a withdrawal. But as our information emphasizes, it was
Yeah.
a very close call, and Davout's corps was almost trapped and forced to fight this desperate battle to avoid encirclement.
Yes.
Fortunately for the French, Davout's corps was one of the elite formations within the Grande Armée, composed of highly disciplined and experienced soldiers. And despite being significantly outnumbered, they managed to successfully fight off a series of determined Austrian attacks in the Battle of Tannhausen, buying themselves crucial time and preventing Charles from achieving his initial objective.
Yes.
And this series of engagements marks the beginning of Napoleon's so-called four-day campaign, this rapid and decisive series of maneuvers aimed at regaining the initiative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So following Davout's successful, albeit difficult, fighting withdrawal,
Right.
Napoleon then cleverly utilized Marshal Lefebvre's Bavarian the 7th Corps and a provisional corps under the command of Marshal Lannes
Okay.
to drive a wedge directly into the dispersed Austrian army. Believing he was pursuing the main Austrian force,
Right.
Napoleon then advanced rapidly on Landshut. The French and their German allies engaged a strong Austrian rearguard
Yeah.
and managed to capture this strategically important city bridge in a hard-fought action.
Okay.
However, it soon became clear to Napoleon that Archduke Charles and the main body of the Austrian army were not at Landshut, and that once again, Marshal Davout's the Third Corps was facing the brunt of the enemy's strength.
So with this new understanding of the situation, Napoleon swiftly shifts his overall strategy. He dispatches Marshal Bessières with a force to pursue what he now recognized as the Austrian left wing,
Right.
while he himself turns north with the main body of his army engaging the Austrian the Fourth Corps under General Rosenberg at Egmühl. The French and their allied troops secure another victory there, their fourth in as many days,
Right.
demonstrating Napoleon's remarkable ability to rapidly concentrate his forces and strike effectively. But crucially, despite these French successes,
Right.
Archduke Charles's main army remained largely intact, and he makes this strategic decision to order a rapid retreat across the Danube River, seeking the safety of the river's northern bank.
And the relentless French pursuit continued,
Yeah.
culminating in a determined assault on the strategically fortified city of Regensburg and its vital stone bridge,
Right.
which was crucial for maintaining communications and supply lines. Napoleon entrusted Marshal Lannes, one of his most audacious and dependable commanders,
Right.
with leading the attack. And when the initial French assault was fiercely repulsed by the Austrian defenders,
Okay.
Lannes famously rallied his wavering troops by threatening to personally lead the next charge himself.
Yeah.
This act of bravery spurred his men to renewed effort and ultimately led to the successful capture of the city. It was during the fierce fighting of this siege that Napoleon himself was struck in the foot by a spent musket ball,
Oh, wow.
an incident that caused considerable alarm amongst his staff and troops.
Sure.
Though, fortunately for the French, the injury turned out to be relatively superficial.
So despite this string of French victories in the initial phase of the campaign, the determined and stubborn Austrian resistance had bought Archduke Charles and his main army valuable time, allowing them to successfully withdraw across the Danube River.
Right.
Napoleon had effectively managed to split the Austrian army, but both sections retreated in relatively good order towards Vienna.
Right.
Napoleon continues his pursuit. But he also has to consider securing his lines of communication and dealing with other threats. He detaches Lefebvre's Bavarian Corps to deal with a growing revolt in the Tyrol region.
Right.
And he tasks Davout's battle-hardened the Third, along with Württemberg's 8th Corps, with this crucial job of guarding his increasingly long and vulnerable supply lines.
Yeah.
Recognizing the futility of a direct defense against Napoleon's advancing army, Archduke Charles makes the strategic decision not to defend Vienna itself.
Right.
And the Austrian capital surrenders to the French on May 13th,
Yeah.
after only a brief bombardment. But instead of defending the city, Charles strategically positions his main Austrian army on the opposite northern bank of the broad Danube River,
Right.
where he could regroup, receive reinforcements, and choose the ground for his next engagement with Napoleon.
Yeah, and this strategic situation really sets the stage for the pivotal Battle of Aspern-Essling. By this point in the campaign, Napoleon's forces had been significantly depleted by the preceding battles and the need to detach corps for other duties, leaving him with a field army of around 80,000 men,
Okay.
facing a larger Austrian army estimated at approximately 110,000 troops
Wow.
under Archduke Charles. Despite the earlier Austrian defeats in the campaign,
Right.
Charles's army had demonstrated a new level of fighting spirit and resilience in several engagements. However, Napoleon, perhaps still influenced by past Austrian performances, held a somewhat low opinion of their overall fighting capabilities,
Okay.
and made the fateful decision to force a crossing of the wide and fast-flowing Danube River in pursuit of Charles.
And the river crossing itself was an incredibly complex and precarious operation. On the night of May 20th, French engineers worked feverishly to construct a series of pontoon bridges across the various channels and islands of the Danube,
Right.
utilizing the island of Lobau as this crucial mid-river staging point.
Yes.
French troops begin to pour across these hastily constructed bridges. And by midday on May 21st, Napoleon had managed to get the majority of Marshal Massena's the Fifth Corps and a significant portion of his cavalry across the main arm of the river, roughly around 24,000 men and about 40 artillery pieces, who then established themselves in and around the two small villages of Aspern and Essling, which lay on the northern bank.
Right.
It seems that Napoleon, perhaps still expecting the Austrians to continue their retreat, underestimated the scale of the Austrian response and anticipated facing only a relatively small rearguard action.
Yeah, and that underestimation proved to be a critical and costly error for Napoleon. News soon reached him that the entire Austrian army,
Wow.
a massive force of around 90,000 men,
Okay.
and supported by some 300 cannons, was advancing against his relatively isolated bridgehead
Right.
in 5 distinct attack columns. And to make matters even more perilous for the French, the Austrians began launching heavy barges and various obstacles down the river, deliberately aimed at the fragile French pontoon bridges. And they proved alarmingly effective, repeatedly smashing the bridges and cutting off Napoleon's crucial supply and reinforcement route back to the southern bank of the Danube for several critical hours throughout the battle.
Oh, wow.
This meant that Napoleon's forces on the northern bank were at times dangerously isolated and unable to receive fresh troops, ammunition, or supplies.
So the battle itself ignites around 2:45 p.m. when the infantry of the Austrian First Column launches this determined attack against the French-held village of Aspern.
Yeah.
The village quickly finds itself under intense pressure, assaulted from 3 different sides simultaneously.
Right.
And our information vividly describes the French garrison stationed in Aspern under the command of General Molitor putting up this desperate and incredibly stubborn defense. The fighting rapidly devolves into this fierce and brutal house-to-house combat, with both sides suffering extremely heavy casualties. It's reported that the French forces in Aspern sustained around 50% casualties in this initial phase of the fighting.
Wow.
Highlighting just the intensity of the Austrian assault. To try and relieve the pressure on Aspern, Napoleon orders his cavalry to charge the advancing Austrian Third Column. However, this cavalry charge fails to break through the dense ranks of the Austrian infantry, who were deployed in their now familiar battalion mass formations, underscoring the effectiveness of this formation against cavalry, especially when held steady.
Absolutely.
Then at approximately 6 p.m., with the fighting for Aspern still raging, Archduke Charles personally intervenes and orders General Bellegarde's Second Column to capture the strategically vital village at all costs. In a remarkable display of leadership and personal courage, Charles himself rides amongst the front ranks of his advancing troops, urging his men forward and inspiring them with his presence. In the face of this renewed and determined assault, the Austrians succeed in capturing the battered village of Aspern after some incredibly brutal and close-quarters fighting. However, Napoleon, recognizing the crucial importance of holding Aspern as an anchor for his right flank, immediately deploys newly arrived French reinforcements to launch a counterattack to retake it.
Right.
highlighting the incredibly fluid and back-and-forth nature of the fighting for this key location, with control of Aspern changing hands multiple times throughout the 2 days of the battle.
Absolutely.
Simultaneously, while the desperate struggle for Aspern was unfolding on the French right, the Austrian Fourth Column launches its own major attack against the other key village in the French position, Essling.
Boy.
Marshal Lannes, one of Napoleon's most experienced and tenacious commanders,
Yeah.
had personally taken charge of the defenses of Essling,
Right.
while he waited for the rest of his corps to finish crossing the treacherous Danube. The initial Austrian assault on Essling was met with a determined French defense
Yeah.
and was ultimately repulsed with significant losses on both sides.
Right.
The veteran French cavalry commander General Despines, in a moment of perhaps overzealous pursuit,
Okay.
led his heavy cuirassiers in a countercharge against the retreating Austrians. Tragically, during this charge, he was struck by a volley of grapeshot from Austrian artillery and died of his wounds,
Wow.
a significant loss for the French cavalry arm. Around 9 p.m., as darkness began to fall across the bloodied battlefield,
Yeah.
the Austrian Fifth Column finally arrives on the scene and launches its first major attack against Essling.
Okay.
However, like the earlier assault, this attack was also fiercely resisted and ultimately driven back by Lannes' determined troops.
Yeah. As the first day of intense fighting drew to a close with the onset of night,
Right.
the exhausted soldiers on both sides sought what little rest they could find amidst the growing piles of dead and wounded that littered the fields around Aspern and Essling.
Wow.
During the relative lull of the night, the French, the Second Corps, and elements of the elite Imperial Guard managed to finally complete their crossing of the Danube River,
Okay.
bringing Napoleon's total forces on the northern bank up to a strength of approximately 71,000 men and 150 artillery pieces. However, disaster struck the French again during the night, when the crucial pontoon bridges across the Danube were once more broken
Oh, no.
by the Austrian barges and obstacles sent down the river,
Okay.
leaving Marshal Davout's powerful Third Corps still stranded on the southern bank and unable to reinforce Napoleon.
Right.
Despite this significant setback and the precarious logistical situation, Napoleon, displaying his characteristic offensive mindset,
Yeah.
decided to launch a major attack on the second day of the battle.
Wow.
His plan was to use Marshal Lannes' reinforced Second Corps to punch through the Austrian center,
Okay.
effectively splitting their army in two.
Oh.
However, before this attack could be launched, the strategically vital village of Aspern needed to be secured once again in French hands.
So the fighting for the battered ruins of Aspern resumes with renewed ferocity,
Yeah.
even before dawn on the second day of the battle.
Right.
And by around 7 a.m., after another series of bloody assaults and counter-assaults, the village was back under French control. Meanwhile, in Essling, further determined, Austrian attacks were launched, but were met with stiff resistance from General Lasalle's cavalry and elements of the Young Guard, who managed to hold their ground. With both his flanks relatively secure for the moment, Napoleon proceeds with his planned major attack against the Austrian center, spearheaded by Lannes' Second Corps.
Right.
As the dense French ranks advanced across the open ground,
Yeah.
they were met with a devastating and concentrated barrage of fire from the numerous Austrian artillery batteries, which were now taking a heavy toll on the exposed French infantry.
Right. And tragically for the French, it was during this major assault on the Austrian center that General Saint-Hilaire,
Okay.
a highly respected veteran who had distinguished himself at both Austerlitz and Jena and was leading the advance of his division, was struck in the foot by an Austrian cannonball.
Oh, wow.
Although he initially remained on the field,
Okay.
his wound was severe and would ultimately prove fatal,
Right.
representing another significant loss for Napoleon's command structure. Recognizing the danger posed by Lannes' attack, Archduke Charles responds decisively by deploying his powerful grenadier reserve
Okay.
to bolster his wavering center.
Okay.
Under the intense and sustained artillery fire and facing the fresh Austrian reinforcements, the French infantry began to falter,
Yeah.
losing momentum and eventually being forced to fall back, having failed to break the Austrian line.
Right.
And at this critical juncture in the battle, disaster strikes the French once again.
Okay.
As the crucial pontoon bridge across the Danube, their only reliable link to reinforcements and supplies, breaks apart for the second time,
Oh, wow.
further isolating Napoleon's army on the northern bank and severely hampering his ability to sustain the fight.
So by approximately 2 p.m. on the second day,
Yeah.
after hours of relentless and bloody fighting, the French had once again been driven out of the village of Aspern.
Right.
underscoring its immense strategic importance and the sheer brutality of the struggle for its possession.
Yeah.
Heavy combat continues to rage in and around the village of Essling, which was briefly captured by Austrian forces in a determined assault before being retaken by a fierce counterattack led by units of the Imperial Young Guard.
Okay.
Napoleon, now facing this growing crisis,
Yep.
with his army severely depleted, his supply lines cut, and his main assault having failed,
Right.
recognizes that his forces could achieve no further decisive success on the day.
Right.
Realizing the perilous situation, he orders his exhausted cavalry to make a series of final desperate charges against the advancing Austrians,
Okay.
in an effort to hold the enemy at bay and buy time for an orderly withdrawal. Then, at around 4 p.m., Napoleon makes the difficult but necessary decision and gives the order for a general retreat back towards the precarious bridges
Right.
and the relative safety of the island of Lobau.
And Archduke Charles, whose own army had also suffered enormous casualties over the 2 days of intense fighting,
Right.
and was reportedly running dangerously low on crucial ammunition supplies, was content to see the French army withdraw back to the island of Lobau.
Yeah.
He chose not to launch a major counter-pursuit, recognizing the exhausted state of his own troops and the strength of the French position on the island. In the final tragic moments of the battle, Marshal Jean Lannes,
Okay.
one of Napoleon's most brilliant and loyal commanders and a close personal friend, was struck by a stray cannonball that shattered both of his legs.
Oh, wow.
He was evacuated from the battlefield, but succumbed to his horrific wounds a week later. A devastating personal and military loss for the emperor that deeply affected him.
Wow. So looking back at the intense and incredibly bloody, 2 days at Aspern-Essling, several really significant insights, I think, emerge for us. Firstly, the long-held perception of Napoleon as an invincible military genius
Right.
suffered a very significant blow.
Yeah.
This battle clearly demonstrated that he was not infallible,
Right.
and that his armies could indeed be defeated in a major engagement. Secondly, the Austrian army, under the leadership of Archduke Charles, demonstrated this newfound level of resilience, tactical awareness, and fighting spirit that had perhaps been lacking in their earlier encounters with the French. And this improvement was undoubtedly a direct result of the significant military reforms that Charles had implemented in the years leading up to the 1809 campaign.
Yeah.
The battle also serves as a vivid and brutal illustration of the complex nature of early 19th century warfare, highlighting the inherent limitations and vulnerabilities of different infantry formations, like the traditional line and the attacking column when faced with determined opposition and effective artillery fire, as well as underscoring the absolutely crucial role of strong leadership on both sides in determining the outcome of such fiercely contested engagements.
And consider this, while Napoleon would ultimately continue to exert significant influence and achieve further military successes in Europe in the years that followed,
Right.
the setback at Aspern-Essling undeniably forced him to critically reevaluate his strategic assumptions and acknowledge the growing capabilities of his adversaries. It served as a stark and sobering reminder that even the most brilliant military minds and seemingly unstoppable armies could face significant setbacks and even outright defeat when confronted by determined opposition and unforeseen circumstances. This raises a really important question for us. What does this pivotal battle tell us about the fundamental nature of conflict itself?
Right.
And perhaps even more broadly about the constant need for adaptation innovation and a realistic assessment of one's own strengths and weaknesses, as well as those of your opponents in any competitive environment.
Absolutely. And if you found this deep dive into the Battle of Aspern-Essling, intriguing and want to learn more about this fascinating period, you might want to further explore some of the tactical innovations that were being developed and deployed during the Napoleonic Wars. Or perhaps delve deeper into the individual biographies and leadership styles of key figures like Napoleon Bonaparte and Archduke Charles. There's a wealth of information out there just waiting to be discovered that can help you continue your own exploration of this truly transformative era in European history.